Today, we are digging into a really pivotal chapter from Howard Zinn's famous book, A People's History of the United States. We're going to be exploring his provocative argument from Chapter 2, the one he calls Drawing the Color Line.
Okay, so let's set the scene. The year is 1619. We're in Jamestown, Virginia, and Howard Zinn kicks off this chapter with this incredibly powerful, almost haunting description from J. Saunders Redding. I mean, just listen to that. A frightening ship, a ship of mystery. It perfectly captures this dark, pivotal moment, the arrival of the first enslaved Africans in the English colonies. And what a moment. It's something that would, change the course of American history for the next 400 years.
So the guy guiding us through all this is Howard Zinn, and what makes his work such a game changer is how he tells the story. See, he flips the script. He's not interested in the great men of history, the presidents, the generals. Nope. Zinn tells America's story from the bottom up. We're talking about the perspective of enslaved people, of factory workers, of indigenous peoples. Basically, all the folks who usually get left out of the history books.
So that ship arriving in Jamestown in 1619, that wasn't just a one-off event, right? It was the start of something much bigger, something Zinn really digs into. It's the very beginning of what the great scholar W.E.B. Du Bois would later famously call the problem of the color line.
And this idea, the color line, is absolutely central to what we're talking about. It's not just about, individual people not liking each other. It's way deeper than that. We're talking about a massive structural divide that's built into the very fabric of society. In fact, Zinn makes a pretty bold claim that this specific racial divide has been more essential to the American story and for longer than in just about any other modern nation.
Which leads us to the big question, really the core question that Zinn is trying to answer in this whole chapter. And it sounds simple, but trust me, the answer is anything but. The question is, how did this all start? How does a system like this actually come into being?
Okay, so in answering that question, we get to the absolute heart of Zinn's argument. And it's an argument that pretty much takes a sledgehammer to a very common and kind of convenient assumption about where racism comes from.
So on one side, you have this idea that, racism is just natural. It's what happens when different people meet. It's just human nature. But Zinn, he says no way. Absolutely not. He argues that racism isn't natural at all. In fact, he says it was deliberately created. It was built, piece by piece, for a very practical and cynical reason: to serve the economic interests of the rich folks at the top, the colonial elite.
And Zinn has this great metaphor for it. He calls it an elaborate web. And the point he's making is that this web didn't just magically appear. Every single thread, every law, every social custom, every brutal punishment was intentionally woven by people at a specific point in history for a specific purpose. It was all by design.
Okay, so if we accept Zinn's idea that this whole thing was constructed, the next logical questions are how and why? What was the motive? And for Zinn, the answer really boils down to a single, powerful idea: control.
Think about it from the perspective of the rich planter class back in Virginia. They had this massive workforce made up of two groups: poor white indentured servants and enslaved Africans. And what was their biggest nightmare? It was that these two groups, who were both being terribly exploited, would look at each other and realize they had a common enemy, their masters. If they united, it would be a disaster for the elite. That fear, Zinn says, is the reason the color line was drawn.
So to make sure that unity never happened, the ruling class got to work building that web of controls we talked about. They made it illegal for black and white workers to even collaborate. They made sure punishments were way, way harsher for Africans than for Europeans. And this is a really key part, they started giving the poor whites these little perks, these small gifts of status. It didn't make them rich, but it was just enough to make them feel like they were a step above someone else. It was the ultimate divide and conquer strategy.
So let's pause for a second and think about the implications of this. Because if Zinn is right, if racism isn't some natural, inevitable thing, what does that mean for us, right here, right now?
Well, it means something pretty powerful. If racism was built by people for a reason, then it's not permanent. It's not just a fact of life we have to accept. And if something was constructed, Zinn's argument suggests, it can be deconstructed. It means we're not stuck with it forever. It opens the door to a totally different kind of future.
But Zinn isn't just a blind optimist. He's really clear that this isn't easy. He says that if you really want to dismantle the color line, you have to go after its root cause, the thing that gave it life in the first place: class exploitation. His point is, as long as you have a system where poor people are desperate and forced to fight over scraps, they'll always be tempted by those small gifts of status, and that division will be almost impossible to heal.
And that really brings us to our final thought, which comes from the scholar and activist Angela Davis. Her words here really echo what Zinn is saying, and maybe even take it a step further. She calls racism a tool used by the capitalist class to keep people divided and profits high. It's a really powerful idea to end on, because it forces us to think about how this isn't just history. It's about the deep, tangled connection between the color line and the economic system that we are all a part of today.